This is the Federal Mobility Policy Update with our panel, Oni Blair from Link Houston, Beth Osborn from Transportation for America, Marta Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative, and Darryl Young from the Summit Foundation. This week, we'll cover federal plans to address the damage of highway construction through Black and Brown communities. Then we'll go to Houston, where plans for Interstate 45 expansion will displace over 1,000 homes, more than 300 businesses, schools, and places of worship. And finally, we'll learn why the highway expansion has been paused by the USDOT. Is the highway violating people's civil rights? All that and more on this week's episode. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. Last week, we told you about the infrastructure package, or the memo about the infrastructure package. This week, we're going to zoom in on the issue of freeway expansion, or the lack of freeway expansion as it should be. With us to join us today is Oni Blair from Link Houston. Hi, Oni.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we have Beth Osborn from Transportation for America. Hi, Beth.
Hello.
And lastly, but not leastly, we have Marta Roskowski with the Mobility and Access Collaborative. Hi, Marta. So let's briefly look at what does the current infrastructure package talk about when it comes to the issue of the effect of freeways on marginalized communities, on communities of color, and on racial justice. Beth, give us a top line. What does this proposal say, and where do you think the administration is likely to go?
Yeah, well, Secretary Buttigieg has spent a lot of time since he was appointed talking about the damage of highway construction through urban areas on Black and Brown communities. And that highlighting turned into an actual proposal for $20 billion to look at reconnecting the communities harmed or divided by interstate and highway building through, with a focus on Black and Brown communities. That proposal in and of itself is exciting, but it was not the first such proposal. Starting about a year ago now, there have been efforts in the Senate to put a similar proposal together that was released this January as part of the Economic Justice Act that was introduced by then Minority Leader Schumer. I think it was right before he became Majority Leader. And then there's been an effort to build on that in this Congress from several members of the Senate that we're working with, and now folks in the House are taking interest in putting it into legislative language. So it's something that's been building over quite a while. My organization, along with the group Third Way, put together a proposal for a highway takedown or bridging, or looking for that way to reconnect neighborhoods with a land trust that would ensure that there's money and effort and protections put in place for the people in that community, both to start businesses, to purchase their land, and not just weather the upside, but participate in the upside of taking down something that has harmed their economy, and also to preserve affordability for those who will it's not appropriate or won't ever work for them to own in the near term. So hoping to see some of these proposals include more of that side as well. But like I said, it's just been building for a while, and it seems like it is really gains traction and something I expect is going to be part of an infrastructure package and or a reauthorization package.
Well, let's take that promising situation and unpack a case study of where a freeway should be challenged for its impact to communities of color. We know that in Houston, which is not immune to freeway construction, in fact, Houston is one of the poster children for induced demand, with the Katy Freeway, which I think has something like 26 or 27 lanes in it, didn't really result in any savings of time. There's another freeway that has been put on hold as a result of the Biden administration. It's the I-45 freeway, which goes through downtown. And in its current form, it would displace a significant number of people and expose other populations to undue amounts of air pollution and a whole host of other challenges and problems. With us today to talk a little bit more about that is Oni Blair. I'm going to toss it to Marta, because Marta, I know you've had particular interest in this. Why don't you set up this conversation with Oni?
Well, Ani, really happy to have you on the show today. On March 8th, the Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, sent a letter to the Texas DOT, Department of Transportation, TxDOT, telling them to halt the I-45 expansion project. At the same time, Harris County, the county that Houston lives in, also sued TxDOT. And for us transportation wonks, this is pretty exciting, right? I mean, we're seeing highways being widened across the country in every city and folks making really valiant efforts to stop them and usually failing. And so, Ani, I know Link Houston has been working on this project for a long time. Can you, how about let's start by just tell us a little bit about Link Houston, and then can you dive into what's going on in Houston with this highway project?
Yes, Martha, thank you so much for setting that up. So again, my name is Oni Blair, and I'm the Executive Director of Link Houston. We are a nonprofit organization that focuses on equity in transportation and on climate justice. And one of the areas where we've been focused is on this North Houston Highway Improvement Project, or the I-45 expansion, as we call it. So I-45 is one of the major highways in the Houston area. It bifurcates the city. So on the east side, you have a lot of communities of color. And this particular project runs from downtown Houston north to our Beltway 8, as we call it, which is adjacent to the Bush Intercontinental Airport. The expansion would go on for about 24 miles and would cost at least $8 billion. So it is a significant project. And the questions about the highway really come from the equity piece of it. So with any highway expansion, the aim of it is to improve the highway so that it is safer, so that there is less congestion for cars on the highway. The downtown area expects that out of the economic development that will come with the highway expansion, removing pieces of the highway through downtown and going around downtown, building some cap parks that will create new pedestrian areas in some of the convention center areas and so forth, that the downtown area may see up to $9 billion in economic development. The challenge is that is great for downtown, but those sorts of benefits aren't seen by all of the areas impacted by the highway. And so in 2017, when the Texas Department of Transportation released the draft environmental impact study, we learned a lot more about what the expected impacts of the highway were. And in that document, it explicitly identified that the project would likely cause adverse and significant impacts on minority and low-income communities. That statement caught people's attention, and people dug deeper and saw quickly that the highway as planned, the preferred alternatives for the highway, would likely bring increased flooding unless some serious drainage investments were taken. It would displace over 1,000 homes, most of them affordable housing, including some public housing facilities. And when you think of 1,000 homes, you're thinking over 1,000 families, so many, many people. It would create, at that time, speeds of 40 miles per hour or even higher on the access roads on the side where pedestrians and bicyclists might be, which means if it's widened and the speed limit's 40, then people are probably going 60 miles an hour next to where a bicycle would be, which isn't particularly safe. And then there are all these other impacts. So losing the green space that we value. We have so many highways and so much concrete that is inexplicable to take away in a city like Houston. Losing churches, particularly in some of the older Black neighborhoods that have been there, or the Latinx communities, and also losing historical heritage and site. I think it's also just important to understand that Houston, you're talking about not just a large city, but Houston itself is the 4th largest city in the United States, perhaps the 3rd after we have our next recount from the census. Harris County, where this sits, is the 3rd largest county in the country. And we've already experienced a lot of flooding and a lot of change. So with flooding, people move. With flooding, we also understand the impact of concrete on our neighborhoods. With people moving in and out, you have people who have never heard of the highway now being experienced to it. So fast forward 2017, people learned about the highway and got together and started pushing back on it. and created a coalition of which Link Houston is a part of it. And so let me pause there for just a second as I set up the impact that we're expecting to have from this.
Great setup for this story, and really interested, knowing that, some of our audience is funders, understanding what the community groups have done. I know there was a really interesting process, almost like an alternative planning process that was put forward to reconsider this. So, understanding the players and the strategies that you guys have put in play would be really helpful.
Right. So from 2017 to 2018, that coalition that I mentioned evolved into being more than 23 organizations that put together a document that outlined all of these different pillars and the concerns: flooding, green space, housing displacement, job displacement. Over 344 businesses would be moved or put out because of this, and pushed back and issued that to the Texas Department of Transportation and shared it with the other major stakeholders. So when you're thinking of this, it's not just they're the residents who are involved and stakeholders. There's the Texas Department of Transportation, which this is their project, so they're the biggest player in all of this. There's also the City of Houston, Harris County, our Transit Authority, Metro, and then our Metropolitan Planning Organization, which we call the Houston-Galveston Area Council, all play a major role. And in 2018 and to 2019, these groups coalesced and convinced the mayor that there was a lot more to this. Between all the people moving in and out of neighborhoods, there's no way that people knew about this project, that there were significant impacts that weren't being accounted for and disproportionately impacting the people living in the neighborhoods who are communities of color. So I should also mention the communities, according to TxDOT's own document, the Texas Department of Transportation's own document, are in populations that range from 67% Black and Brown to 92% Black and Brown who are impacted by this project in the neighborhoods. Getting the mayor to understand that these impacts are not the nice, shiny new downtown economic revival, but they're negative and disproportionately impact communities of color, we got the mayor to listen. And that was from showing up at city council meetings, writing letters together as organizations, sitting down with different city council members and with members of the county. And in the summer, and doing reports, both short, technical reports that we could provide to the Texas Department of Transportation or release publicly, but also doing research. There's an organization called Air Alliance Houston that did a great health impacts assessment that we helped with and showed the air quality impacts on children, the 26 schools within the danger zone of this highway. In 2019, we did two big for small organizations like us, press conferences that got a lot of attention, not a lot of people showing up, but a lot of media attention. And then we had a huge turnout at a vote on the highway. This vote was set up at the Metropolitan Planning Organization for $100 million as a down payment on one of the segments. We got hundreds of people to show up and 65 people, 61 of them speaking against the highway as planned, to show up on a weekday at a meeting that usually has 0 to 1 public speakers. The public comment session went on for 5.5 hours. Some of the elected officials ordered pizza, which ran out literally in 5 minutes. And it showed the mayor that people cared, and maybe there was more to this, and that, what we were telling him was a problem really was a problem.
You got their attention.
We got their attention. So the group approved the $100 million, but they put their foot down and said, okay, we'll move forward with the down payment, but clearly there's an issue about the impact on communities that needs to be addressed. And that thread has continued since then. So a lot of things changed at that moment in 2019. And first of all, one of them was that the mayor moved forward with the public engagement process. And here is where we see the role of funders come into play. So the mayor recognized, I need to listen to the people. And we convinced him of that, but he didn't know how to do that at that moment after the project is already in play. A funder, Houston Endowment, stepped up and realizing that this was an opportunity for people to be more engaged with decision makers, helped to support a public engagement process that continued for a year and went through many communities, in which the mayor went back 3 times to the same communities to educate people on the project and then to ask for their feedback, and then to really test results and ask them for their specific feedback on different visualizations and ideas about what could be done. And out of that, the mayor decided that he changed his mind about the project. It wasn't the decision of the stakeholders. It wasn't the decision of the funder. It was the mayor's choice. But through a really authentic, really, really well-supported public engagement process, when the mayor did that, he publicly stated that he had a new vision for the project, and then used some of the funding with which he had also gotten consultants to outline what that might be in terms that could relate to the Texas Department of Transportation. See, the challenges for many people is that we don't speak engineering, and we don't speak planning, and we don't speak flooding and drainage. And so it is very difficult for, the average person to be able to communicate on a level that translates into an idea with someone in the Texas Department of Transportation or any Department of Transportation. And so that became a new vision. And then a lot of the elected officials started rallying behind this mayor's new vision because it spoke to directly reflecting the ideas of the people and neighborhoods being impacted, but also translated it into an actual project that built on what the Texas Department of Transportation wanted and still addressed moving people, but did so in a way that protected the vision and the planning of what Houston wants, and not allowing someone else to define what the city should be based on highways.
Okay, so
did you also find that it changed the way the press covered the project?
Well, the press didn't really cover the project before. So yes. Suddenly, I mean, the reality is that media is based on the human story. And when something is just about the highway, there's no humanity in that. And so when you start to talk about the impact on, Mrs. Johnson or Mr. Jackson or whomever it may be living in the shadow of a highway, who honestly in the Houston area, this is a repeat offender sort of story, right? Like, we're recidivists in this nature. We have done this again and again and again. That is what environmental injustice is. And so many of the families are talking about my grandmother was displaced by the Pierce Elevated, which is this connector for I-45, or, my church used to be here and no longer here, or my church was here and used to have a beautiful green space and now is already on the edge of the highway and needs to be moved. In 2018, and I hope I got that right, when we were really just getting started as an organization, Beth, to your point, we reached out to the Houston Chronicle and said, we know you're covering this and you're getting ideas about it, but we'd just like to show you what is out there. And we went out and our team went and knocked on doors and went and met with people and understood what was happening with many contacts from churches to businesses to people in their homes. And we got one of the journalists to come along with us. We used our little $300 to rent a van and we briefed the journalists on the way from site to site. And then when we got to the site, and by we, I mean we as the stakeholder, as the advocates actually did not talk. We did all the prep work beforehand. We had the community members talk on each of the stops and on the van. But we would stop at a location and the person who's basically in charge of the equivalent of a chamber of commerce for there would get out and talk about the impact on businesses. And we'd stop at somebody's home, and that person, we'd already been in contact with them, would show this is what's happening in my house, or this is what's happening at this part of the neighborhood. And people were able to speak. And that was really the first time that this became a human story and had real storytelling behind it.
So Ani, you go, Darryl, then I have a question.
All right,
okay.
So what I'm hearing from you is that being able to put a face on what we're talking about makes a difference. I mean, philanthropy was good. The Houston Endowment supported the Texas Tribune, who early on was starting to cover this 2 or 3 years ago. I've seen stories, I've read stories of, there was a woman who was an Army veteran serving abroad. She came back, she bought a house, and they're putting a freeway right next to it, right? And so those human stories bring into play the civil rights aspects of it. And I think what's unique about this is that the civil human rights of people are being used to condition how a freeway is built or expanded. That's a telling thing for funders to come away with, is that it's not just about miles of asphalt. It's about the human face of what's going on. And Oni, you've done a really good job explaining that to a whole wide set of people well beyond Houston. So congratulations,
Well,
Martha. I'll defer to you.
if you don't mind, just really quickly, Darryl, you bring up a really good point. One of the ways our organization works is we both do data-informed research, and we work with communities to help them understand who decision makers are and amplify their stories. And we tell people we do both for a reason. If you give people data, they're like, oh, where's the data? I've got it. This is great. And then they forget it without a human story. And if you have the human story, people are like, oh, that's really nice, but surely that's an outlier. That can't be what everybody is experiencing. So you need both, because when you have the data and you have the story illuminates what people are feeling, but it also shows that it's not one experience, but that it's on a trend. And so I think this highway is exactly an example. You could say 1,000 homes, but until you meet that person who is actually losing their home or who has already lost it, it doesn't mean anything to you. And that's where the support from, funders can really come in, whether it's for the storytelling piece or the civic engagement piece, so that person can get there and even knows that that meeting exists to go. Nobody knew that the Metropolitan Planning Organization even existed. We tell people it's the most powerful body that you've never heard of. They control billions of dollars that control your everyday, and you don't even know they meet like every month. So getting people to that meeting, those are all different ways that, funders can really be involved in this and that they've never thought of, even if they're not interested in the transportation piece itself.
Yeah, so let's come back to today. So a month ago, FHWA the Federal Highway folks told the Texas Department of Transportation to pause. Houston is suing the Department of Transportation. Harris County is suing Texas DOT to stop this project. From what you say, you elevated all these voices. You got a lot of people on board. Is TxDOT not listening? How did we end up at a place with the county suing the state and the feds telling the state they have to stop? That would suggest that the nice, let's have a conversation and rethink this highway needed some more horsepower.
It does. So the Federal Highway Administration's pause is based on their review now of those Title VI civil rights claims, of which there are just a handful of those. That's a very formal, rigorous process, of which there are very few things that come through that process. There are thousands of public comments that capture a much broader terrain of what people have as concerns or hopes for this project. And then the lawsuit is actually a fairly broad lawsuit by Harris County of the Texas Department of Transportation, really around all of these things that are identified, in the mayor's vision and the inequities of the project. Any Department of Transportation entity is, running on what they know. And a public entity has a very difficult time doing public engagement, especially on these long projects. And this is not to defend them. It's just the reality. And I remind people too, people living in some of these neighborhoods did not live there 10 years ago or 15 years ago when this plan came up, or even 5 or 6 years ago when the original public engagement came out. People move. We're one of the fastest growing regions in the country. People move to places that don't have flooding. Some of these neighborhoods are not flooded. Some of them are flooded regularly, and so people are moving out of them. Not the same people living there. So even on the best day, this doesn't really work very well. And then you have just the reality that they're created to be a lot of people who work with numbers, and they're not used to this public engagement piece or listening to people right now. And so you have a lot of problems in how this system works, and which is why we remind people, we're focused on this fight, but this fight is not just about I-45. It is about every fight across Houston, every fight across Texas, every fight across the country that is impacting communities of color that have repeatedly seen these impacts and repeatedly don't have access to the systems that decide them. They don't know that they're happening. They are repeatedly disproportionately impacted by the air, the loss of green space, the drainage, the fast cars, the lack of infrastructure that allow you to walk to the actual businesses around them. It's all of that. But if you live out in the suburb, it's great for you. And that's not really fair. And this is what we're talking about. Beth set up very well the changes that we're seeing in the Department of Transportation. But I would also say that we're starting to see how those systems are changing and even the funding piece. So earlier this month, the U.S. Department of Transportation announced the Infrastructure and Rebuilding America grants. And these have been around for a little while. They've been renamed, over the last couple of years. But what's important now is that the focus is on, these quick turnaround grants, was on racial equity and climate justice. That shows that there's a change in where these investments should be. But it's not just the money piece. It's also going to take who decides and who has a seat at the table to be able to inform and decide this over the long time. Philanthropy has a role in all of this as well, being able to pilot projects so that government, which is very risk averse, can see what it's like if something new is done, being able to fund opportunities that help people understand who the decision makers are and to be able to have access to data and information that doesn't happen on its own. Especially in a time like COVID when people have very limited access, being able to support the advocacy. We work with communities that wouldn't otherwise have access to the data. Like, we sit down with them and say, you tell us your priorities, we'll help you translate it into something that they can understand, because otherwise when you go in there and you say, I want to keep my house, they're like, what's the vision? I want to keep my house as the vision. Why don't you understand that that's the vision? Right. But there's a whole way that philanthropy has supported this, and that as we go through this, not in just one place, but it can be extrapolated across the country. That's really important to change systems.
Yeah. So Ani, I know you mentioned Houston Endowment was a big player. Who else has been supporting your work, this work, from the philanthropy side?
So in our work on a broader piece, I will also say for us, because this work is moving so quickly, what is most helpful for an organization is funding that is for operational support, because it allows us to be flexible and to be able to respond to these things that are happening in real time. Like, I couldn't have predicted that we were here now, or that I would be spending this much time on the highway even 6 months ago. Because you don't know. And so that's what allows us to do this.
I'd say that's true across the board.
That's true across the board. But there's Houston Endowment. Energy Foundation has been supportive, especially as we start to integrate the climate justice piece. The GPP Mobility Fund, we are grateful to be among the first the first grantees for that, as well as Hive, Gender and Climate Fund, and Tides Foundation.
Great. So I know we're close to out of time. Ani, we could talk about this for a long time. Let's go, Beth. Why don't you give us the bigger picture? Like Ani says, we're zeroed in on the fight in Houston. This is a fight that's happening in basically every single metro area across the United States. What are you seeing from your broader lens?
Well, it's a big advancement to talk about taking down or bridging or reconnecting communities across assets like this. But we have to recognize that while some communities want to fix the damage, others are willing to double down on it and add to it and cause further damage to those communities. There are not a lot of tools at the federal level to stop them. There is Title VI. I don't consider NEPA a threat to them at all, so long as the project is funded. Title VI, which is about civil rights, gives a little more power to the feds. But again, there are ways to mitigate the damage, and a lot of these statutes are about lessening the damage, not preventing it. And I would say there has been very little focus on making it harder to propose these projects that will provide no long-term benefit. In fact, it will create a long-term problem that will require more expansion, because we are basically inducing the problem that we will then pay the folks that created the problem to fix. So there's a lot that needs to happen at the federal and state levels, requiring them to use more honest projections, more honest models, more honest information, and make it available to the public. for those projects that have such limited benefit. It should not be credible to say, I'm going to give people 4 years of 2 minutes of time savings, and in exchange, we're going to take away 1,000 people's homes. That should meet with a gasp. And while it might on this broadcast, it does not nationwide. And we need to publicize the choice we're putting forward more and make people recognize that their very limited time savings that might mean they leave a minute later in the morning is not worth displacing human beings and their whole families and destroying neighborhoods. So that's what we need to look at for the infrastructure proposal. That's what we need to look at for reauthorization. And at the state level, when state DOTs and legislatures consider putting more money into their program, those are the things we need to require in order to justify their getting a penny more of our money.
I mean, can we have a conversation about the opportunity cost of $8 billion spent in Houston? Think of how much more transit service, how many more bike lanes, how many more potholes we could fill with $8 billion.
For the opportunity loss of taking all of that land out of productive use and putting it into a use that is just going to cost people money.
To put it in perspective, I mentioned that over 1,000 affordable housing units will be lost. The $8 billion, Beth, doesn't include the right-of-way acquisition, so it'll be much.
Oh my God!
That has been clarified multiple times by the Texas Department of Transportation. So we're talking a lot more than that. But right now, Texas Department of Transportation has put into the final, project document that they'll invest $24 million in affordable housing. $24 million is like 100 units based on everybody I know who's in affordable housing. It's just not enough. So the $8 billion in a place that's already in the news for one of the highest eviction rates during this COVID-19 recession. We're talking about displacing lots of people where they already have, including people who are reliant on public housing and are going to get Section 8. Where we don't have Section 8. So all the problems that we're thinking about, like the suburbanization of poverty, how do you get back to a job? Can I afford my car once I live out, really far away from where the jobs are here in the Texas Medical Center or, in the other activity centers? It doesn't add up for me. And you don't need somebody who is an expert in planning to say, this does not make sense. So it's about protecting your city. I would just remind people, and especially funders, as they're thinking about this, I did not work on highways before I came to this job, and I love the work that I do, but I always see it from the rights perspective. This is about access to opportunity. And so what is the point in investing in access in affordable housing if people cannot reach it, or in education if people cannot get there? And so reminding funders all the time that the transportation line item in a budget that any organization presents is important. Being able to think about an alternative way for people to reach that opportunity. If you have something that you're investing in, why invest in public health if you have not been able to invest in a way for people to affordably be able to reach there? Whether that's approving the line item in the grant, or even thinking more broadly about normalizing it, normalizing that instead of advertising the garage parking, that you're also saying where people can ride the train or where they can park their bike, so that it is completely normal. But also getting back to the rights aspect, I love to remind funders too that you don't have to fund anything in transportation. This is really about civic engagement and access to government and decision makers. And if you are involved in civic engagement, you should be thinking about transportation, because it is not about what party you belong to. It is about access to opportunity to everything that matters. A magnet school only works for the kids who can get there. Yeah. All of this is about transportation. Yep. And so it is really important to be able to lift up and to be able to connect that to everything that is funded by funders. And then most importantly, advocacy. You don't have to give bus passes out. If you help people do the advocacy and show them the way, they will make the choices that are important, but somebody has to be able to support that advocacy. It is not a free ticket, but it is a long-term investment, and I see the importance of it every single day.
Well, so what you've talked about is really valuable information, not only for local place-based foundations, which in many cases are more involved, but also national foundations who come at the issue for a variety of reasons. And I think you're absolutely right. We're going to take what you said. We're going to put it on a laminated piece of paper, and we're going to send it to every funder to put at their desk.
I love that.
Yeah, the opportunity is now, because as more federal dollars are coming towards all of this, it's a cautionary tale not to repeat the sins of the past. And so as we close, unfortunately, we have to close. We like to close with something that's somewhat interesting, slightly off topic. And today, the topic is, what are you reading? So I'll start, modeling good behavior. I am rereading Pedaling by Jeff Mapes, Pedaling Revolution, which it's a book that's been out for a while, but I'm looking at about how bikes can play a profound role in changing the way our cities are designed. So I'll now toss it to Ani and to Martha. Are you next? Okay.
I do, because in the land of Zoom, I have another meeting right now, so I'm going to leave you very shortly. Okay, I was reading the article this morning by Sarah Jo Peterson on a blog called The Metropole, The Myth and Truth About Interstate Highways. You want to go deep into the tragedy of what we did with the interstate system? Great article. It says it's a 48-minute read. So.
Okay, and Ani, what are you reading?
So I have these handy, and so I've already read these, but they're relevant to today. So always anything by Dr. Bullard, who is here in Houston at Texas Southern and the founder of the term Environmental Justice. And then Power Moves is about highway advocacy. So if you want to hear how people beat highways and how they've been beaten, then this is focused on Houston, but it's a great tale, and it's by Kyle Shelton, who is at the Kinder Institute.
Beth, what are you reading?
I am reading resumes from folks who are interested in applying for our policy director position, which has been opened by the fact that a member of Congress stole away my policy director to be his chief of staff. So if folks are interested in applying, I'm going to be setting up interviews this afternoon and over the next few days, and I would love for you to send talented people our way. You can find the position description on our website.
Going to work for Beth is like working for the Justice League and the Avengers together for this better plan. And if there's a Wonder Woman, Beth would be the Wonder Woman.
I'm definitely more of a Marvel person myself, but I do love Wonder Woman.
MCU. So. All right, well, Martha had to jump off. We've got to jump. Thank you so much for being here today, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Darryl, Beth, and to Martha. Bye.